Hi, I'm Paul Horn. Through the Speech Center, my fellow coaches and I have worked closely for many years with the McPhee program and have produced this video to help you and your team prepare and deliver a great final presentation to your clients. Keep in mind that several factors will play a role in planning your presentation: the size and makeup of your audience, the degree of formality your client prefers, whether you are presenting in person or through WebEx, and so forth. We can't anticipate every individual question that might come up. We'll leave that to the individual coaching sessions we have with each team and the conversations with your project leaders. But we do want to touch on 5 key areas of universal importance: opening the presentation, organizing and guiding your audience through the presentation, avoiding death by PowerPoint, managing Q&A, and keeping it physical. So let's talk about the opening. Open your presentation with a brief, relevant story. After some quick personal introductions, the best way to engage an audience, almost any audience, is with a story that reflects their interests and goals. That's certainly true for your McPhee clients, who sought help from Babson because their company saw a problem or challenge or opportunity they wanted to better understand and pursue, whether for operations, marketing, financing, or some other business strategy. So before you present an agenda or engagement slide, we suggest you set the stage with a concise and colorful story that provides context for your project, the situation that gave rise to this client engagement and set the direction for your work. Imagine, for example, that your client is a small, family-owned hardware store. Let's call it Weintraub's, that thrived for generations before the big box stores and online shopping barreled their way into the consumer marketplace. So your client was facing new competitive pressures and needed a survival strategy. There's your basic story. It doesn't have to be, and often won't be, terribly dramatic, though you should try telling it with some dramatic flair. The important thing is that you paint a picture for your audience of the client's needs and challenges, the issues that brought them to the McPhee program in the first place. Make it clear what's at stake for Weintraub's. The other good reason for opening with a story is that it helps those audience members who aren't familiar with a project to grasp the basic issues, get them intrigued about your approach to these issues or problems, and appreciate the relevance of your work. That would generally include Babson people who are learning about your project for the first time, but could even include people from the client side who haven't been directly engaged with or fully briefed on the project. Once you've hooked or engaged your audience with a brief, relevant story about the client, you're ready to explain your engagement contract, setting forth the purpose and the scope of your work. Sometimes clients forget the limits of the work they agreed to, so a quick reminder is often helpful to manage expectations. You could either show the relevant part of your engagement contract, the purpose and scope, on a slide, or simply summarize it with a few simple bullet points on that slide. Then give your audience a few seconds to read it and ask any questions they may have. Here's what an engagement contract excerpt might look like for Weintraub's hardware store. Let's talk about how you organize the presentation. The biggest challenge for most McPhee teams is figuring out the best way to present the data they've collected, analyzed, and used as the basis for their principal findings and/or recommendations. You want to give your audience a clear, easy-to-navigate narrative, a verbal path through the thicket of information. It's a challenge, first of all, because you have to be selective. You don't have time to present every fact or statistic or share every example you've collected. And even if you did, it's unlikely that your audience would have time or capacity to absorb it all. So you have to choose and highlight what's most important. Less, as they say, is often more. That's partly a matter of making sure that your thesis, your hypothesis, conclusions, or recommendations are clearly and logically presented along with the arguments or evidence that support those positions. Make it easy for your audience to follow your logic. Of course, you may have more than two reasons to offer for any thesis, and supporting detail, as we call it, can mean a variety of things: external data, interview or focus group results, probability analysis, historical trend data, and so forth. The point is that using a diagram like this one can help you clarify your own thinking and establish a clear hierarchy of information, making it much easier for your audience to understand and absorb what you're saying. This organizational tree approach can work, by the way, for writing or speaking, and it can work with any analytical tools you may have used in your actual analysis, a SWOT analysis, Porter's 5 forces, the 4 Ps of marketing, and so forth, for example. And these are concepts, by the way, that you probably will need to explain to your audience. But whatever tools or methods you use, staking out a clear narrative path for your audience and guiding them carefully along that path is critical. So take time to offer helpful examples, offer quick summaries along the way, and use strong transitions. Another way to approach organizing your presentation is with a uniform thematic structure appropriate to or adapted to your subject matter. Some simple and familiar examples of thematic structures might include problem-solution, chronological, before and after, pros and cons, good, better, best, short and long term, high, medium, low priority, cause and effect. You get the idea. And I mentioned the importance of strong and smooth transitions, the remarks you make as you hand off to the next speaker. You want to make those handoff remarks meaningful, tying one point to the next. So, for example, you might say, "So it's clear that Weintraub's now faces some growing competition, but as we said earlier, we've got some recommendations on how the store can meet that competition with some new pricing strategies and through a new social media campaign. Chris will now explain those ideas." That's much stronger than simply coming to the end of your remarks and simply handing the slide clicker to Chris. Remember, it's not just a series of individual presentations, it's a team presentation. So make sure to use strong handoff lines that tie your individual presentations together. So let's talk about another favorite topic of mine: avoiding death by PowerPoint. For better or worse, and sadly, often worse, PowerPoint has become the lingua franca, the common language of the business and academic world. Your clients may actually tell you they prefer to receive a PowerPoint deck over a traditional report or executive summary, and of course, you should honor their wish. At the same time, though, you need to avoid the biggest PowerPoint pitfall: the tendency to cram too much information, especially a lot of text, onto the body of the slide. All that tends to do is create an uncomfortable conflict or competition for the audience between wanting primarily to listen to you while feeling obligated to read and make sense of the slide. And making matters worse, if you have a lot of text on your slide, you may tend to start reading the slide aloud, word for word, losing eye contact with the audience and boring them to tears. Think about it. Doesn't that drive you crazy when you're listening to a presentation? So the trick is to use the body of the slide primarily for visual images: photos, diagrams, graphs, flowcharts, cartoons, you get the idea, with text kept to a minimum, maybe just 3 or 4 short bullet points, formulated as phrases, not whole sentences. Here are a couple of examples. Here are some more specific techniques for avoiding death by PowerPoint. Put your actual remarks, your script in effect, in the notes section of the slide, as you see here. Here you can refer to them while you're practicing, but your audience won't see this while you're presenting. This will also serve anyone who has a copy of the slides and wants to review what you had to say, or the person who wasn't able to attend the presentation but who can catch up by looking at the slides and reading your notes. In fact, writing out a script, frankly, is a good idea anyway. It forces you to figure out and polish what you want to say. Second point would be creating a title that conveys the main point of the slide, like a newspaper headline, one main point per slide. Your audience should be able to skim the slide headings as many of them may actually do in a time crunch, and get the gist of your presentation that way. Take this approach with your opening title slide, too. So rather than McPhee Project for Weintraub's hardware store, how about Weintraub's new life for an old hardware store? Put some pizzazz into it, hinting at your overall theme. Next, consider animating slides that may be too complex by themselves, revealing only part of the information at a time. Build the logic and focus your audience's attention one element at a time. Make sure your font size is large enough. 24 points is a pretty good rule of thumb, but it varies. And make sure you have sufficient contrast with the background of the slide. And please, don't go crazy with different fonts or other stylistic elements. They're simply distracting and annoying to an audience. Avoid busy slides. But if the information on the slide does require some explanation, make sure you give your audience enough time to absorb it. Remember, you've been working on these slides for several days or weeks, but your audience is probably seeing them for the first time. Consider reserving some slides for Q&A and/or for the appendix of your deck or final report. Finally, on the physical side, as much as space allows, try to stand at a wide angle to the screen so you won't tend to turn your back on your audience if you need to turn to the slide to point something out. And that, by the way, you should do very sparingly. Audiences don't like to watch speakers swiveling back and forth between them and the slide. Let's talk about Q&A. The Q&A, question and answer period, may be the most critical, but also potentially the most satisfying part of your presentation for you and your client. That's because the client gets to ask the questions that really matter to them, while you and your team have an opportunity to clarify, qualify, or reinforce important points. And in the best of all worlds, the Q&A period isn't adversarial, like an interrogation. It becomes more like a good conversation, perhaps with some disagreements, but with better overall understanding. In any event, you should prepare for Q&A by discussing questions you think may come up and how best to answer them, particularly by recognizing any weaknesses or uncertainty in your research and the questions that may probe for those weaknesses. Here are some general do's and don'ts for Q&A. First of all, make sure your audience knows that you've reached the end of the formal presentation and are now moving into Q&A. For example, you might say something like, well, in summary, by adopting the pricing and social media strategies we have described, we believe that Weintraub's hardware store can compete with the big guys and enjoy a very bright new future. Then, invite the questions graciously. Instead of, okay, are there any questions? Say something like, with that, I think we're ready for some Q&A. What questions do you have for us? Smile, be positive. Listen carefully to the question. Let the speaker finish before you start answering so you really understand what's being asked. And if it's a long or complicated question or you're not sure everyone has heard it or understood it clearly, it's a good idea to restate or paraphrase it. This can also buy you or some other team members some time to formulate an answer. If you're not sure you understand the question, ask graciously for clarification. Not, I don't understand the question, but let me be sure I understand your question. Are you asking, so forth. Consider a short, vivid example with any explanation that might be complex or highly technical. Keep your jargon under control. Business school students, we all love jargon. But explain acronyms or other technical terms unless you're sure that everyone understands them. Listen carefully to what your colleagues are saying so you're not redundant, or so that you can acknowledge what they've said, or so that you can spot issues that may be unclear or confusing. And if a colleague misstates something important, or if you sense that their explanation isn't sufficiently clear, see if you can offer another way to explain whatever it is, or offer another example. Be careful to avoid phrases, or be careful with phrases like, as I or as we pointed out earlier, or as we said before, because that can make it sound like you're criticizing the questioner for not having understood or listened to you earlier. It might be true, but it doesn't help to sound critical or cause embarrassment. If you don't know the answer to the question, say so, but offer to find out and make sure you do. Finally, All that said, your client may interrupt your presentation with questions, and of course, that's their prerogative. And if the question calls for a quick clarification, that's a good thing. Otherwise, if it involves an issue you plan to address later in the presentation, you might simply say, "Thanks. If you can hold on, Chris is going to address that very issue in a couple of minutes." Let's talk about something we haven't mentioned at all yet: making it physical. The physical delivery of our presentations always matters because our impact on an audience is always some combination of content and delivery, the verbal and the nonverbal. If we say that some fact or principle is critical, we should sound and look like we mean it, not looking at the slide, but facing the audience, speaking with strong articulation, and making good eye contact. All those nonverbal behaviors that affect how or whether our message is received. And as you rehearse, watch yourself and your colleagues for unconscious but defensive body language. Typically, for example, arms crossed against one's chest, which can make you appear annoyed, impatient, or uninterested. Speaking too quickly may be the single biggest problem with the presentations I've observed. If we talk too fast, hardly allowing ourselves time to breathe, we aren't likely to be very persuasive or even understood. And that lack of breath can in turn cause nervousness. Look, the audience wants us generally to be relaxed, serious and well-organized, but relaxed and conversational. Speaking too fast also tends to invite those annoying little verbal fillers, the uhs, the ums, the likes, ya knows, and so forth. On the other hand, a slow, dull monotone, no inflection in the voice, risks putting your audience to sleep. So, what's a good pace? In a word, a varied pace, brisk at times, slow and deliberate at others. Sometimes the most effective thing we can do as speakers is to pause after making an important point, to let that point sink in. If you're not used to doing that, the pause may seem like an eternity, but an audience often appreciates it. Watch how Steve Jobs varies his pace in this excerpt from the 2001 presentation introducing the iPod.
You know, I've got a big hard disk in my portable, let's say my iBook. I'm running iTunes. I'm really happy. I got FireWire on my iBook. I don't quite get 10 hours of battery life, but iBook's got better battery life than any other consumer portable. So what's so special about iPod here? It's ultra portable. An iBook is really portable, but this is ultra portable.
Finally, remember that the presentation begins the moment you enter the room and you are on stage, observed by the audience, even when you're not speaking. So don't let your attention wander. Stifle the yawns and make sure your cell phone is off. Finally, I lied or misspoke. There is a sixth step, and you probably guessed it. You've got to practice. After all, it's a performance, like a play. An oral presentation is both an intellectual and a physical performance, and practice is the best way to deal with nervousness, to get those butterflies to fly in formation, as the old saying goes. So take advantage of the resources for good practice and coaching, particularly the Speech Center and, of course, your project leaders. You're the subject matter expert, but we can help you with both organizing your content and polishing your delivery. We also suggest videotaping yourselves to see what you're doing well and to pinpoint areas for improvement. Meanwhile, my fellow speech coaches and I will look forward to seeing you as you prepare your final presentation.